We've got three championship rematches for the weekend in college football in the Power Five, including the one that kicks off the weekend. Stanford, USC, they played way back in September. We bring in Don King from Last Word on College Football to help us break down the Cardinal in particular, also the Trojans as well. Don, how you doing this afternoon?
Splendid, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing great. So this is the weekend. There are so many different Saturdays in college football, and by extension, the Fridays and the Thursdays that means something special. We just came through one with rivalry weekend in college football, but championship weekend, I just have to applaud the origin of championship games in college football for the conferences. I hope that they haven't been depleted, although I know better by the college football playoff, but here we are with the Pac-12 crowning its champion tonight, Stanford and USC. So my first point will be there's one big difference in these two football teams that's obvious to all of us, and that's one Mr. KJ Costello playing quarterback for Stanford this time around.
That's right. And we've been watching him grow up over the last few weeks now. Was solid against Cal. Not spectacular, but got it done. Played really well against UW, but more importantly, played his best game of the season against Notre Dame, and it's not even close. It's a very different offense with Costello pulling the trigger. His moxie, if you will, and his ability to move around in the pocket. He's got good, natural pocket awareness, and is able to slide around left, right, forward, and get the ball downfield to the hands of those big wideouts and tight ends on the outside. So I honestly think this game is going to play a lot differently from the one in week 2. It's going to be a lot closer. We've seen Shaw do this on occasion, most notably in the Rose Bowl a couple of years ago. I think you're going to see Stanford throw to set up the run this year. Or tonight, which is opposite of the way it almost always plays. I think it's going to be a very fascinating thing to see. I think it's going to be a very tough, well-played, close game. Both teams are well coached. I think it's going to come down to turnover margin. The things he usually does: turnover margin and time of possession, and field position.
USC with arguably the most talented roster in the conference. Stanford showed us something in defeating Notre Dame and really dominating the fourth quarter against the Irish at home. USC doesn't have that kind of win against that quality of a team. They've beaten some decent teams, Arizona in particular, over the backstretch of the season. Your thoughts about Stanford, and in addition to the Costello situation and him taking the reins at quarterback, what's different about this team week 2 now in early December? What is better? What's worse? What are the adjustments and the changes that you see in this team close to 3 months later?
Yeah, what's better? We've already touched on it. Quarterback play is better. And that's not a knock on the other guys. Chris in particular, he had at least one game this season when he was spectacular. Which kind of held Costello off for a bit, but he finally, kind of won the job and seems to have taken control of it. What's worse is the health of the roster. The obvious gimpiness of that ankle by Love, and what he's done on 1.5 legs is remarkable. But it's even more noticeable in 2 other places. One, starting left tackle Walker Little is out again for this evening's game. He will not play. And there are a slew of defensive players, critical, significant defensive players, who a couple of whom have been out for a while, like Elijah Holder, but a couple of others who are not going to be able to go. I think Aaron Cotton, last I heard, was listed as doubtful. It doesn't look good for him to be able to play. So there's some key players who are not going to be able to go tonight for Stanford on both sides of the ball. SC, conversely, coming off its only bye of the season, had a week and a half to get itself healthy. So that's going to help them. Now, the other thing I would say, though, despite some of the attrition on the defensive side of the ball, Stanford's defense has been lights out over the last month or so. They have played extremely well. And credit to Lance Anderson, whether he winds up landing a head coaching gig sometime during this offseason or not. That defense has improved steadily. The scheming has gotten better. And there was a really good piece written by RJ Abadia, highlighting the halftime adjustments that Anderson is able to make and how much better Stanford is in the second halves of games versus the first half. And that's kind of been throughout his tenure, but it's been remarkably true this season in particular. And honestly, I think Stanford owes the resurgence and the ability to capture the Pac-12 North title to the defense even more than the offense getting its act together.
Stanford USC, the Trojans at 10-2, the Cardinal at 9-3 in the Pac-12 championship game, with the North owning this series since the inaugural game 6 or 7 years ago. It's been Stanford and Oregon owning this situation, with Washington with a win over Colorado last year. You mentioned injuries, and you mentioned the unique scheduling situation for USC. I'm sure Clay Helton didn't like playing 12 consecutive games, but since he was able to persevere and his troops through it to get to the championship game, then there's the advantage of A, you have the week off, B, you play a Friday championship game. So the short week after a tough opponent for Stanford in dealing with Notre Dame last week. USC, a banged up football team, but mostly, and I'm not going to speak to each and every injury, the situation different in that USC was banged up early season.
Right.
And they've had to be able to fill in with lesser players, with younger players as well, that have now have valuable playing time. Porter Gustin, probably the most notable of the guys missing, one of the better linebacker DN/DNs in the Pac-12, but he's been lost for several weeks now. So USC, in looking at game one, just latching onto that one more time, Don, is there anything that you can take from that game that you think this is still a concern, other than obviously USC is a talented football team? But what surprised me about that game was Stanford has dominated the series in recent years. Then USC comes into that game and they owned the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, they did. It's going to come down to the game plan. It's going to come down to Lance Anderson being able to find ways to slow that dynamic offense. And, you know, he's shown an ability to do it time and again. So you got to at least give him the benefit of the doubt that he'll be able to come up with some things to not have the exact same thing happen the same way it did in week 2 or week 3, whatever that was. So I expect that dynamic to be a little different, but SC is going to move the ball and SC is going to score. And that's where Stanford's offensive improvement comes in, because I think Stanford's going to be able to move the ball better and probably score more in this game as well. I don't know if it's going to be a shootout. I don't think this is going to be a terribly high-scoring game, but, you know, it's the kind of thing where, you know, Stanford can hold SC off the board one time more than it did, you know, in the first matchup, and score itself one time more than it did, and now it's a one-score game, and then anything can happen. You know, and the last point here is the South is going to break the streak at some point. There's no question about that. You know, think about this. Next season, you could have Chip Kelly at UCLA in a Pac-12 championship game. You know, he knows how to win those things. That could get interesting. The converse, though, is David Shaw's 3-0 in the championship game, and it's hard to pick against him because he seems to find a gear and find a way to scheme better. And in each case, it's been against a team that Stanford has played previously. This is the first time that they actually lost that first matchup, but they've all been rematches. And he's found a way to get over the hurdle and the one that mattered the most each time. So we'll see what happens.
Cardinal and the Trojans should be a great game. Don, you can give a prediction, or if you want to send us the last word on college football for one, I'll leave it up to you.
Now I'll give it to you now. I'm not picking against Shaw until he loses one of these. I've got Stanford 31-27. I think it's a good game, and I went and looked up the line, and the over/under is right at 58. And so I'd like to tell you I'm that good, but I don't think I am. That just was the score I happened to land on in my head. I do think it's a one-score game either way. And yeah, I think Stanford will find a way to grit it out and come out on top.
All right, I've got myself about 5 hours to pull the trigger, and I will do so sometime between now and then. All right, Don King from Last Word on College Football. You got to join him. You got Tony Siracusa, who joins me on a regular basis here. Mike LaValle. They do an exceptional job there at Last Word, breaking down the nation across the board, the topics with all the coaching upheaval. Certainly a lot to dive into right there to get a better understanding of what's going on and what could happen in the next several weeks, again, concerning the playoffs, the bowls, and these coaching situations across the country. I don't know that we've seen anything quite like what we've seen in recent days, Don.
I haven't. And, I've been a pretty rabid college football fan for a few decades now. I've never seen anything like the way this week has gone. Mike, you mentioned Mike, he's going nuts, being the Tennessee Volunteer loyalist that he is. It's just been a tremendously wild and wacky ride. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens from here. The latest looks like Phil Fulmer is going to be the AD. We don't know if it's going to be interim or full time, and I think that changes everything all over again. So, the Pirate to Knoxville, not so fast. It could go an entirely different direction now. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and for somebody who's not close to the situation, that would seem like the safe, and I'm not saying that in a critical way, but in a term that says we need stability in this situation. Yep. Bring in Philip Fulmer, and people are going to respect and listen to him, and he's shown wisdom throughout the ages beyond just the football field, and he's well respected.
Yeah, it's going to calm the waters, and that's exactly what they need right now.
All right, Don King from Last Word on College Football. Got to join him there for college football coverage. Don, it makes for a better Pac-12 coverage for me when I have you on to give me some perspective on Stanford football and beyond. So we appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I appreciate being here. Take care.